Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is March 20th. Today's case takes us back to 1961 to the conservative town of Odessa, Texas, where a tragedy unfolded that would be remembered as the Kiss and Kill murder. 17-year-old Betty Williams was found dead, and the almost unbelievable circumstances surrounding her death sent ripples through Odessa and beyond. This is a story about young love, heartbreak, mental health, and a crime that left the entire community divided. Today, we'll talk about who Betty was, the night she was killed, and the trial that followed, which remains one of the most controversial in Texas history. Let's get started. Betty Williams wasn't like most of the other girls at Odessa High School. Just 17 years old, she had a sharp mind, a rebellious nature, and a love for literature. She was particularly drawn to the works of Jack Kerouac and other countercultural writers. While most of her peers in Odessa stuck to traditional values, Betty had a progressive and outspoken nature that made her stand out. She wasn't afraid to challenge expectations, and that, of course, made some people uncomfortable. Then there was John Mack Herring. He was 18 years old, a star football player, and someone everyone in town seemed to admire. He was handsome and athletic, basically the classic all-American boy. On the surface, Mac and Betty were total opposites, but despite their differences, the two fell into a short but intense romance, one that would ultimately lead to disaster. At first, Betty and Mac seemed happy together, but high school relationships are rarely simple, and theirs was definitely not an exception. While Betty was completely invested, Mac began to feel the weight of societal pressure. Odessa was a small town, and Betty's bold, unconventional personality didn't always sit well with others, especially Mac's friends. Her openness about sexuality and her rejection of gender norms made her a frequent topic of gossip, and Mac, feeling torn between his love of Betty and his reputation, eventually chose his reputation and broke things off. The breakup devastated Betty. She had lost not only her boyfriend, but the sense of belonging that had come with being in this relationship. She felt alone, misunderstood, and trapped in a town that had little patience for someone like her. As the months went by, Betty's mental health declined. She spoke often about feeling hopeless and confided in her friends about how she wanted to die. But tragically, the people around her didn't take these statements seriously. Then came Betty's most shocking move. She approached Mac with an unthinkable request. She asked him to kill her. At first, Mac refused. The idea, of course, horrified him. But Betty wouldn't let it go. She insisted that death was her only escape and that he was the only person she trusted enough to do it. Eventually, her persistence wore him down. And just to make it absolutely clear that this is what she wanted, she wrote a note absolving him of any guilt and saying that she made this choice herself. On the night of March 20th, 1961, Betty and Mac put their plan into action. Mac drove Betty 26 miles outside of Odessa to a remote stock pond on his family's property in Winkler County. She had dressed for the occasion wearing a red nightgown under her clothes, a symbol maybe of her acceptance of her fate, or maybe the womanhood she would never know. Sitting in the car, the two had one last conversation. Mac asked her if she was sure, and Betty reassured him that she was. Then, in a haunting moment, Mac asked for a final kiss. Betty honored his request, stepped out of the car, and walked to the edge of the pond. Mac retrieved a 12-gauge shotgun from the trunk, approached her, and after a brief hesitation, pulled the trigger. Betty died instantly. Mack, now fully aware of what he had done, tied weights to her body and submerged her in the pond. Then he drove home and attempted to act as if nothing had ever happened. Everything eventually came out and Mack was indicted for murder. But before his formal trial, his defense team requested a preliminary jury trial to assess his sanity at the time of the crime. And this request was based on an affidavit from Mack's father, which claimed that Mack had been in, quote, a temporary state of insanity and had been unable to distinguish right from wrong. A jury was asked to determine a single question. Do you find, from a preponderance of the evidence, that at the time of the act charged by the indictment in this case, the defendant, John Mack Herring, was insane? The jury's answer was yes. Under Texas law at that time, this meant that Mack was declared legally insane at the moment of the crime. And this effectively led to an acquittal. The prosecution disagreed with the ruling, though, arguing that the court had no jurisdiction to conduct a preliminary trial solely focused on insanity. They sought to overturn the verdict, claiming that proper procedures had not been followed. The Texas Supreme Court reviewed the case, ruling that the original court's decision was invalid, as the correct legal procedures had not been followed. This led to a new trial, but in the end, the final outcome remained the same. Mack was acquitted. Betty's family and supporters were outraged. To them, this wasn't justice. This was a legal loophole that allowed Mack to walk free. After his acquittal, Mack tried to lead a quiet life. He attended Texas Tech University, worked in construction and the oil industry, and largely avoided the public eye. He married twice, both ending in divorce, and lived in West Texas until he passed away in 2019 at the age of 75. Betty's story, however, never faded. It has been the subject of books, articles, and documentaries, most notably Washed in the Blood by her cousin, Shelton Williams. Her case is a tragic reminder of what can happen when mental health is not prioritized, especially in vulnerable young people. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!